Hello everyone and welcome to a new term of Bristol Talks Economics. Just a quick reminder that if you have any questions in the duration of the seminar, just pop them in the chat or send them directly to me. If you're on YouTube, just comment them, and then Ben, who's moderating, will pass those questions on to me. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Claudia Sahm. Professor Sahm is a contributing writer for Bloomberg and the New York Times, and she also runs a consultancy, Stay at Home Macro. She's formerly worked for the Federal Reserve and Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, as well as progressive think tanks such as the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, get that name right. It was here that she did the research that led to her name being given to the Sahm rule, which is a recession indicator, as well as the foundation of her work with automatic stabilisers. Back in July, she published a blog post called Economics is a Disgrace. This exposed experiences of gender and ethnic minorities in economics and sparked an urgent conversation about economics and its culture. So hello, Claudia. We're very pleased to have you with us here today. And, so from the introduction, you have done a lot of work, and the undergraduates here will be very interested in how, your career got going.
Yeah, no, and thank you so much for the invitation to come talk with all of you today. And I do look forward as we go along to hearing your questions and, make sure I'm having the dialogue, the conversation that you all want to have. So in terms of, and thank you, Anna, for such a kind introduction. In terms of how I got to where I am, when I went to college at Denison University, when I started as an undergrad, I had no idea what an economist was, what economics was. I mean, I had, read the newspaper. I knew like some of the players, frankly, some of them like Larry Summers, Bob Rubin, they're still in the news decades later. But like, I didn't really understand what it meant to be a student, to study economics. I was fortunate that my first semester, I had an amazing professor for an intro to economics. It was an honors class, Saurabh Bedad, and I ended up becoming a major in economics along with political science and German. I have a hard time choosing. I like lots of stuff. But I went on and my senior thesis I wrote with Professor Bedad. So and I did a Fulbright in economics in Dresden in Germany. And after that, I came back and worked for 2 years at the Brookings Institution with two great economists, Gary Burtless and Barry Bosworth. And from there, I went to Michigan. Now, there were times where I was like, I don't know what this is. When I was in Germany, the coursework wasn't like what I fell in love with. Like when I decided I really love economics, it was at Denison. And when I decided I really love macro, it was because I was taught, I believed, and I still do believe, that economists have the ability to do a lot of good in the world. And when I got to Dresden and I was taking master's level econ classes in German, and I had this one class that was game theory. We were using a US textbook, always in German. I was like, what is this? Like this, I mean, I love math, but I was like, this is not what I thought it was. And when I went from there to Brookings, I worked on economic policy questions, and I was like, oh yeah, this is it. And I understood towards the end of it that I really enjoyed doing the research, and I didn't have the tools to really do the research. And so then 6 years at Michigan, I, left with those tools, and I started straight from there at the Board of Governors, the mothership of monetary policy in the United States. And I started in the summer of 2007, and I was hired to be one of the lead analysts for consumer spending. And so my first forecast was January of 2008. And my first year was absolutely horrible. I mean, it was horrible in the world. And then I had like massive imposter syndrome and trying to learn how to do my job when it really mattered. But, I learned in my first 3 or 4 years at the board, I learned like a couple decades of macro and what's good and what's bad about it. And I was very fortunate towards the end of my time at the board, I was working on automatic stabilizers and sending money to people, which in 2008, when they sent the rebate, that was my first forecast. So I've been working on these things for quite a while, both in my policy work and in my research. But at the Fed, you can't be a Federal Reserve economist and go to the Hill and tell them how to do their job. Like, that's not allowed. So I had to leave the Federal Reserve, both so I could do work with congressional offices, but also so I could have a more public voice. Then I went to a think tank and I had the opportunity. I mean, I've worked with over 20 Hill offices at this point on various parts of fiscal relief, and with many of them related to automatic stabilizers. And so that's been a real privilege to put that information and just give advice. Like, the politics of it are their own thing, but I can come as an economist. I can make lots of spreadsheets, charts, talking points. Like, I could do this stuff in my sleep now, and I drop everything to do the congressional work. Um, but I mean, I write for the New York Times opinion and Bloomberg opinion. I write at the Times about the Federal Reserve and sometimes fiscal policy. And I write at Bloomberg about inequality. So I feel absolutely and then I've got this like snarky macro mom blog. And I started a Substack because there was a live policy debate about cutting back on who gets the $1,400 check. There was a study put out by Raj Chetty and his team at Opportunity Insights that was deeply flawed, and I wrote a blog post about it. And
Yeah,
that's, so
shall
it's like
we?
this big journey. So sorry.
Yeah, shall we go into like detail about the Substack that you mentioned? So that was published like yesterday, the day before, so very
Yeah.
recent. And so you have been a very vocal activist for direct and automatic payments to struggling households in economic downturns, and this isn't just a it's not just this was before this pandemic. And can you talk us through a bit about like the benefits of the automation of those payments?
Yeah, so you're correct. I have done a lot of work pushing these direct payments to people. They're often called stimulus checks, sometimes rebates. We've done them in the United States in past recessions, 2001, 2008. Like, they work, they provide relief. What's different about them than a lot of the other relief programs is that they're much more universal. Right. So the checks, the CARES Act, the $600, they went to 90% of the US population, women, men, and children. Right. All you had to have was a social security number this time to get one. Now, the top 10% didn't get one. They don't need one. I don't need one, though I would spend it. But like, they've worked in the past. And so it's like, if we know there's something that works, sometimes politics bogs down, like, and we've seen that this year, and we saw it in the Great Recession too. So it's like, if we have a set of policies, sending money to people, enhancing the jobless benefit system, making food stamps better, let's just put it on autopilot. Let's tie it to economic conditions. This was where I developed, I mean, if you're going to tie it to economic conditions, you have to tell Congress, here's what you should tie it to. So in my chapter that was about making payments automatic as soon as a recession starts, continuing them if the recession is severe, like until we have the recovery, I had to have some way of saying turn it on, turn it off. So the turn it on was what's now called the Sahm rule. I did not name it this, but that's what it's called. And what it does is what I was able to show is that very small increases in the unemployment rate, like half a percentage point, have happened at the beginning, early in every recession since the 1970s. And frankly, it's very reliable, even going much further back when the data, weren't as, um, you know, they wouldn't have the same methods to collect them. So this is something that I have spent a lot of time on. I've worked on helping write legislative text that would turn on programs, especially I've done a lot with unemployment insurance. Like, it's so amazing to see the Sahm rule in legislation that, I mean, I'm not holding my breath. It's not passing right away. They've got to get this emergency relief out, but it's really encouraging. Like, the work that we do, the work that you all will do, like, it takes you plant seeds, it takes a long time for them to, reap the benefits, have you be in a place where you can really share what you know. But like that moment will come. And I'm exhausted. I've done 3 press interviews this morning and now this. And I mean, that Substack took a while to write over the weekend. So, but like this is the moment. Like I've spent a lot of time in school and at the Fed and doing this is what I'm here for.
Yeah, you're doing great. Yeah, and I think what you haven't really mentioned is what the undergraduates here will have sort of been taught as a good recession indicator is yield curves and inverted yield curves. But basically, I think what's remarkable about the song is that it has a very low rate of false positives, unlike the inverted yield curve.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of interesting in sort of discussing what properties we think a recession indicator would have. Obviously, false positives is a very important one, and avoiding them. Do you think in future research there are going to be any other properties that we want recession indicators to have?
So I'll say this, like when I worked at the Federal Reserve, they look at all kinds of indicators. You look at the yield curve. The yield curve is something that, while not as reliable, it's something that gives you like a potential signal a recession is coming. The Sahm rule does not tell you one is coming. It tells you we are in it, right? And so the Federal Reserve, like I knew from being there, small increase in unemployment rate are bad, right? But they're trying to get ahead of a recession. And so their rules of thumb were a little different. Whereas I'm like, I'm asking Congress to send out a couple $100 billion. I think we should probably get that right. So I need to be able to have indicator that first of all was accurate. And I could show historically it was accurate. And second of all, it's got to be explainable, right? Like the reason that we hate recessions and the reason the federal government steps in and local governments step in to fight it is because people lose jobs. People like struggle. It is hardship if you have been working and you can no longer work, right? Like that's why recessions are bad. That's why the government steps in. That's why, we all step in some way. So to me, the unemployment rate, like it's why we hate recessions. It's easy to understand. I mean, and it's widely followed and we get it quickly. There's models like they're called regime switching factor models. And then you've got this yield curve inversion. Good luck writing that into legislative text, right? Like the Fed can use all these kind of tools because it's behind the scenes. It has to be simple and straightforward, and it has to be defensible. Like this is a lot of money and it's a pre-commitment. Like Congress would say ahead of time, we're going to do this. And they really don't do that often.
Yeah, I know we talk about the Sahm rule a lot, but I'm aware that actually most people we're watching might not know what that is. So could you just give a brief explanation?
Yeah, and I gave the high level changes in the unemployment rate, but very specifically, it is I take the 3-month moving average of the monthly national unemployment rate. Why the average? We don't want to overact to one little bumper wiggle in the data. So you take the 3-month moving average, and then I take the most recent reading and I compare it to all of those readings over the past 12 months. And if I've seen that the most recent is a half a percentage point or more above the prior 12 months low, we're in a recession. I'm probably a couple months into it. I will say it's not like I'm the first person to be like, are we in a recession? The other indicators that are often used are like a 2-month or 2 quarters of a decline in GDP. That is basically what the IMF uses to identify a global recession. I mean, you got to have something. That takes months longer. Like that's 7 months before you get that data, and it often revises. In the United States, we have a group at the National Bureau of Economic Research, so the NBR. They are called the Recession Dating Committee. Do not let them set you up on dates. They're very mature, let's put it that way. And anyways, but they decide when a recession started, when a recession ended. In 2008, it took a full year before they said when the 2008 recession started. Congress cannot wait a full year to say with confidence, oh, we need to send out relief in a recession. So we did have ways to think about recessions and identify recessions after they'd started, but they weren't well suited to pump out hundreds of billions of dollars, right? Like, let's hit go. Now, I will say the thing that I'm working on a research project to refine our thinking about when is an appropriate time to phase out or to stop, and then to stop these extra relief, because we've never done anything like this. I can't look at the historical experience of the unemployment rate comes up, it goes down. And so I'm working in a research project using a distributional macro model, which is referred to as a heterogeneous agent new Keynesian model, or HANK. Economists should not be allowed to name anything. So there's like Hank and Tank, and there'll probably be Frank soon. Anyways, but like these models allow me both to look at what happens on aggregate to total employment as these policies are continued. And it also lets me look at how do the effects differ by low income households, high income, by different racial groups. So that's a project I'm very excited about. It's research. I got to have the world like quiet down a little bit, a little less press. But that's one where, we can have, like, oh, within 2 percentage points, the unemployment where it started. And I think there's very reasonable, but I want to and try very hard to do evidence-based policy making.
Yeah.
I have to create evidence here. So
Yeah. So I think what you're saying about, you're trying to find a sort of like, stopping point. Do you think this is sort of like, is what sort of, distances you a little from, modern monetary theory, as it's, sometimes known? I know, some of the audience here watched our Stephanie Kelson talk a couple of weeks ago.
yeah, so I think, and I've been talking with people a lot about this. There's a robust debate in the United States right now about this $1.9 trillion package. There's a lot of discussion about are the details of it right? Is it going to the people who need it most, right? So there's that, and that's like the relief aspect. One thing I like about that package, because it covers so many, like money goes to all families, money goes to the unemployed, money goes to state and local governments. Like, it covers a lot of ground, and I think that's a very good principle. There's also a debate about, is it too big? Like $2 trillion after, CARES Act was 2 trillion. There was another trillion at the end of the year. There was some stuff in between, and now we're going to put another trillion out. This is a lot of money. Even the United States, we have a $20 trillion economy. This is a lot. So there's been a discussion about, oh, it'd be too much, and maybe the economy will have inflation and blah, 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 which is fine. We should talk about risk. But what I focus on, and this is a place where Stephanie and I really overlap in our thinking, is the goal is full employment. The goal is a recovery for everyone. Right now in the United States, we are down 10 million jobs relative to before COVID. And jobs should have kept coming, right? In a world without this pandemic, we would have kept having more and more jobs created. That is a massive hole that is larger than any time in the Great Recession, which was a biggie, right? So we are on par with a shortfall in people being able to work that we have not seen in living memory. And you would have to go all the way back to the Great Depression to find anything like this. And so, to me, if you use that lens of full employment, then you say 2 trillion is the very least we should be doing right now. And I firmly believe, and have worked with members of Congress, the next thing that should come is 2 trillion for infrastructure, broadly, like investing in people. So, like, I've thought a lot more about modern monetary theory in the last year or so. I have had discussions with people who are very much experts and very much pushing that. Also, people that work on basic income, which is not something I had, because my stuff is about fighting recessions, right? Like, it's a different conversation. But I worked at the Fed for over a decade. I've thought really hard about monetary policy. So I'm open to, and I know monetary policy can't do it alone, right? So there's all this discussion about the tools we've used for decades and decades just aren't enough. So what do we do? And then that means bring in a lot of different viewpoints and let them duke it out.
Okay, so I think these sort of questions of scale lead us to this audience question, and Katia, I'll ask your first one first. So do you think the scale of QE, and I think you've kind of covered the answer to this one, will present problems in the future? Should we worry about the Fed's expanding balance sheet?
Yeah, so I worry about it, but in a way that I'm not sure is the most common concern that comes up. So the Federal Reserve, all of its tools work through interest rates or asset prices. And they cannot, under their current authority, just send money out to people, right? And so if you can only work, and they don't control interest rates or asset price, they just kind of like poke on them and try and move them, like interest rates down right now. And by virtue of what they're, and stepping into markets that were failing in March and being like, we'll be there to backstop you. The stock market, the recovery that happened into April, that was the Fed, right? Because the stock market was reacting to an immense amount of disruption in financial markets. Like the US Treasury market was seizing up. Like that's never happened. Like we've never seen that happen. That's very bad. So the Fed was able to step in, be the lender of last resort, which is why the Bank of England was created. I mean, that is the core function of all, and you all got a couple hundred years on us there. That's the core. Actually, my God, maybe 500 years. Jesus. Anyway, so, but like that's the core, like function of central banks. That's why we exist, to put out fires. And then there's this, what they call macro stabilization, where you try and keep us out of recessions and keep us from like mass inflation. And their tools are interest rates is a very weak tool. And when interest rates hit zero, or the federal funds rate hit zero, then we had this quantitative easing, expanding the Federal Reserve. And so now that did put more downward pressure on longer term interest rates. Like that's the kind of thing, if you go to buy a house, if you take on credit card debt, like it's those longer term rate. Like none of us get to borrow directly from the Federal Reserve at the federal funds rate, right? So like they had to go into a different space to try and push interest rates down. This worked. The problem, and this is an unavoidable but very negative consequence, is that we have seen wealth inequality increase. And a part of that is, well, if the Federal Reserve can step in and they are able to stabilize financial markets and we see stock prices going up, the only people that can benefit directly from that have stocks, right? And in the United States, there is massive inequality by wealth. You cannot benefit from an increase in asset prices if you do not hold that asset. So this is something that I worry a lot about. And I think this is one of many reasons why in the last year we have seen Federal Reserve officials, including Chair Jay Powell, be very loud and very explicit that Congress has to do more. Because not only are the Federal Reserve tools not as effective, but they do some things that fiscal policy could counteract. And like if fiscal did more, the Fed could do less. So it's
so let's stay on the topic of the Federal Reserve. So unlike the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve has a sort of dual mandate, where its role is to both control inflation, also to maintain low unemployment. I know one of your many criticisms of the Federal Reserve is that it has sort of been very, quite hawkish on the first, mandate, and quite lax on the second. So, do you think this has been a problem in the current recession? And do you think, going forward, are there any, ways to ensure it, sticks to the second mandate more?
Yeah, I'll start with the history a little bit and move to the present. The history is more depressing than the present. So the mandate for maximum employment was they amended the Federal Reserve Act in 1977. That addition of, not only do you need to keep prices stable, which means like inflation relatively low, you need to achieve maximum employment. that addition to the Fed's mandate grew directly out of the civil rights movement. The Martin Luther King Jr. focused a lot on wages. His widow, Coretta Scott King, was standing at the side when key legislation was signed with the Federal Reserve Act. Particularly, she was there when they had the Fed has to go to Congress every or twice a year and explain how they're doing, and if they're not doing a good job, what's going on. So this history that it comes out of racial inequities in the labor market, like that was given to the Fed. Now unfortunately, the Fed, I don't know, blithely ignored is probably not the right term, but what they, I mean, actually it is the right term, but I'll be more generous. What they did, actually, they openly derided it, and you can see it in archives of the meetings at that point, but they defined it in, maximum employment is as low as we can get unemployment before inflation starts to rise. And so essentially they do have a dual mandate, but they managed to redefine full employment, so it's actually all about inflation. Anyways, but it was a time in the late 70s where there was a lot of inflation in the United States. So I don't want to, like, there was a reason they did it, but over time when inflation came back down, they didn't update their thinking about full employment. In my time at the Fed, and this was in the middle of the recovery, like this may be 10, 11, 2012. That was the first time that the full employment mandate, the maximum employment mandate, showed up in the statement after a Federal Reserve meeting. So it had taken decades and decades before the Fed put it front and center. More recently, the Fed did a big review of its monetary policy framework in 2019. In the summer of 2020, they marched out like a change in their framework, which, I mean, I can get into it. It's not like a huge, it's like a little baby step. But what they did in justifying it was to say it's because we are going to push to full employment. And until we really see inflation, we are not pulling back, which is a sea change from, oh, inflation's around the corner, maybe we should like raise interest rates. So now we are nowhere close to full employment. So we are nowhere close to seeing if the Fed really sticks to it, but I have been heartened every time Jay Powell has spoken, and his last press conference was crystal clear. We don't, we are not going to act on interest rates prematurely. He has this cute quip where he's like, we're not even thinking about raising interest rates. So, I mean, he's trying every which way he can to tell the world, we ain't raising rates until we're sure that things are to a place where we really feel like we must. So that's a big deal. Now, words are just words. We'll see. And the Fed, and I wrote about this at the Times, the Fed has a long history of putting inflation and financial markets ahead of people and Main Street. So we'll see. But it's positive. We're pointed in the right direction.
Do you think that in economics as a subject more generally, do you think the sort of goal of full employment has sort of gone in and out of fashion? Do you think we're sort of in this sort of like a sort of retaliation to, like, formerly being sort of like quite unfashionable, say with Milton Friedman, and then now it's sort of like becoming more popular again, if that's the right word?
So I think it's always been popular with people, right? Like, and while the Federal Reserve got its maximum employment mandate in the late 70s, you can go back and the concept of full employment, everybody who wants a job being able to work, often everyone who wants a job has a job that's a living wage job. You can trace that all the way back to the Great Depression. Like that was a concept that FDR had in place with the New Deal. It has been reaffirmed, particularly in a racial justice lens. But like, if you need a paycheck, you want to be able to get a job, right? So now it is very clear, and I look at a lot of survey evidence, like University of Michigan has a survey where they just ask people, like, how are you feeling about the economy? What do you react to negatively? And it's been running since after World War II. And it's clear, like, people don't like inflation. No one likes their paycheck getting eaten up. Now, most people will totally ignore it until like its prices rise a lot. like, for gas prices, they go up, or I mean, like, it's not like a couple percentage points of inflation, like, whatever. And people even more hate unemployment, right? So if you ask people, like, you got to pick one or the other, like, jobs matter. And we've seen jobs, like, you can look across the federal government, like when FDR is talking about full employment, it's about the federal government, like fiscal policy, not the Fed. You ain't going to find a lot of discussion about, do we need stable prices and inflation of 2%? I mean, this is like a Fed thing, which makes sense given their mandate. But I just want to underscore, like, it's broadly popular, and it's really considered almost something akin to a human right. Like, if you want, because that's about being able to fulfill your dreams and your potential. Now, in the economics community, yeah, like, I mean, there's always some place
That's a different
that's
question.
emphasizing it, but it moves in out of fashion. And I do think in Congress, like, I already talked about the Fed's history with full employment and like ignoring it, but in Congress you do see different concerns come in at different points. And a lot of it's like tools, like, are tax cuts the way to grow the economy? This whole like trickle down economics, like, if you help people at the top and corporations, will that mean more jobs for people? So you see the dialogue change and how we can get the economy to the best place, how we can help the American people. I mean, Congress is elected, right? They can't go too far off the rails. But like, full employment as a concept or as a goal moves around. And one thing I've been working very hard on in a fiscal policy space is to really emphasize that what we need right now is a recovery for all. We need everyone to get back to work. You'll hear a lot of discussions among macroeconomists, especially in the last couple of weeks, talking about, well, but GDP is almost back on track. And potential output, like GDP, because income is so unequal, opportunities are so unequal, like, that doesn't tell me about everybody. It tells me about the economy, but we're not here to get GDP back on track. We're here to get people back to work who had jobs that they lost by no fault of their own. And that, like, does not, like, the main macro models that are used to like argue about the size of the fiscal stimulus, that's not there. Whereas that's what I applaud, like Stephanie Kelton and others working on MMT, like full employment. If you read kind of their goal, the way they're thinking, as a, like, when we can say mission accomplished, is full employment, right? So that's, but it's missing in a lot of the models in the conversation. But it's so, like, duh, I mean, this is like what people want. Then this is about economists doing good in the world. Like, we really, we don't get to pick what good is. We are told what the goal is, and then we bring the tools we have and the best advice we have.
So I think that kind of brings us back to your work with Congress. So, the CARES Act was, a really radical, stimulus for the economy. But you did, take your automatic stabilisers to Congress. Can you tell us a bit about, the sort of response you saw there, and how you talked to us about how important it was to have a very understandable and very, usable indicator. Were there any other sort of, points you made when you were trying to sell it to a sort of politician?
Yeah, honestly, there is a lot of interest and support for automatic stabilizers. One of the biggest plans that I've worked on that's out in public, like the proposal, was there's a new Dem coalition caucus. And it is bicameral, so it has both House and Senate members that are part of it. It's largely moderate Democrats, and they have the Beyer, Bennett, and Reed, so those are three members of Congress, have a very detailed proposal about putting the enhancements of unemployment insurance on autopilot. Things like expanding eligibility, giving extra weeks to long-term unemployed, and this extra weekly, adding the money that goes into every week's jobless benefit payment. So that's a really well-developed proposal. I was working with Bennett's office like in November of 2019, right after I left the Fed. So that's been a long-standing project. There are other members' offices, people who are looking at this in terms of the direct payments, putting them on autopilot. Nancy Pelosi endorsed them when they were working on the CARES Act. The thing is they cost money, especially when you're in a recession, because remember, it's tied to the economic conditions. So once we're in a recession, unemployment is really high. So all of those extra benefits for unemployed, they're really high. Like if you tie direct payments, I'm going to do them every 6 months until the unemployment rate is back within 2 percentage points. Like when the unemployment rate is 10 percentage point or 10%, when the Congressional Budget Office sits down, turns the cranks on their model and gives like Congress, this is how much it will cost. Those price tags can get big. In May, I spent Mother's Day weekend doing my own cost estimate of the Bennett proposal, which was to put UI on autopilot. This is the kind of thing I learned how to do at the Fed. There aren't a lot of people that know how to do this. Anyways, so Mother's Day weekend, I'm like doing my thing and I've got all these assumptions and stuff, and I costed it out about $2 trillion.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money. So like there's a real conversation. In a lot of ways, it's cheaper in terms of the budget cost to do it outside of a recession. But like outside of a recession, people kind of forget how bad the recession was. So I'm hoping there's momentum, and it could be something like in an infrastructure package, but like it's made a lot of progress. I've been very encouraged by that, but it's a sea change in the way we fight recessions. So you want to make sure that you do it right. So
Yeah. Okay, so I'm aware that there's still some audience questions on the subject, but we haven't talked a bit about. Yeah, there's another one there. We have talked a bit about. We talked about the whole sort of recovery package for quite a bit now. So I think obviously at the moment that's the Biden administration's main policy, and not to be like too flippant, but in a sort of like US correspondent sort of headspace, like what do you think after the pandemic, however long that is, what do you think the next few years of Bidenomics look like?
yeah, so when Biden was putting his campaign together and really refining his message about what the priorities would be when he was doing that last summer, the phrase that they've used to define his agenda is build back better. Okay, so at the time I was working at Equitable Growth, Heather Boucher was the president and CEO of the think tank, and she was advising Biden, like talking to him every day about what's happening with COVID off the clock. Like she couldn't do that as the think tank director. But we had a lot of conversations with the team of policy experts that were at Equitable Growth when we would talk to Heather, and we were doing a lot on the recession. I was doing a lot on the recession, and it's kind of like, okay, the recession, we got to fight this, but we need to think about what's next, because we don't want to just get back to February when COVID hit or before COVID hit. We want to get back to somewhere better than February, like deal with the inequalities, deal with the injustices. Okay, so what my impression is, I'm not inside the White House. I don't talk to them.
Yeah.
Heather doesn't really talk to me anymore. But what happened is in the winter, COVID came back. I mean, you all lived this too, right? And so when it came back, that meant people were afraid, rightly so, to go out in public. You had major cities shutting down. And the progress we had been making on bringing people back to work since the spring stopped, right? And there are some places where we've seen things going in reverse. So that meant when President Biden came into office, the conversation was not about the building back. What they really had to do first, and this relief package, which I don't think they imagined they would have to pass this 1.9 trillion back in July when they came up with the campaign, but the world is what it is, and it has not been good for the last year. So the reality was, before they can start the building back, they have to get us like just under control. And so but because so much of their thinking, because you asked about the Bidenomics, so much of their thinking has been about the building back better, dealing with inequality, dealing with a social safety net that is not it is not working, is broken.
Yeah.
So they have those, and that's what I think we'll see going forward.
Can you expand on the social safety aspect? I know you, I know you wrote an article in Bloomberg a while ago about the failings of the unemployment system in the US, and so it sort of has exacerbated, you argue, geographic and racial inequalities. Can you sort of explain about some structural issues there?
Yeah, so the unemployment insurance system was founded in 1935. So it was one of the, with Social Security. So it was one of the pieces of the New Deal. This is our core automatic stabilizer because it ramps up in recessions. More people get benefits. We spend more on it. It comes down in expansions. I read a wonderful history of that, the New Deal, and about a woman named Frances Perkins, who was instrumental through the entire FDR uh, uh, administration in creating these programs. She is an amazing person, an inspiration. And what I talk about in my last Bloomberg piece is like the system, obviously when it starts, it's missing people. Like one group that was excluded were people that worked in agriculture, like on farms, or did domestic service, like worked in homes. That was I mean, they had to do that so they could get Southern votes because that included a lot of people of color, Black and Hispanic. Individuals were more likely in those jobs. So from the very beginning, it had racial inequities in it. Over time, those sectors of the economy were covered. Some parts of the economy, like seasonal work in agriculture, is actually pretty hard because there are work requirements in the past because you pay it, your employer pays into the system. So it's not perfect. It had improved over several decades. And then what we've seen is basically a war on the unemployment insurance system. And so you talk about the geographic disparities. It is a state-run program. The states have discretion on some aspects of it. One that I find mind-boggling is that states can determine the standard weeks of benefits that you are eligible for. In most states, it's 26 weeks, and in the state of Florida, it's like half that. Right. And then Florida actively makes it difficult to get benefits. So just by virtue of where you live, it has, and most workers don't understand this while they're working, you have great disparities in the ability to access, and it's not random where it is. And there's good research out of a think tank in California where they have very detailed data on California jobless claims, like who's filing, who gets approved. I mean, you do have to document that, like you have the work history, and there's very clear disparities. Like communities that have high fractions of racial and ethnic minorities are much less likely to get benefits. And one statistic that was in my last Bloomberg piece was that the Census Bureau tells us half of U.S. households lost income last year, but only 20%, under 20% of US households got any jobless benefits. So that's just one way in this present moment of seeing the disconnect. Like, and this was loss of employment income, that 50%. And in the piece, I talk about, like, historically, we've been missing lots of workers. CARES Act helped more workers than in the past, but we're still missing millions of workers. I get very frustrated with economists and people, well, that's mainly economists, who are like, we shouldn't give out checks, we should do the unemployment benefits. And I'm like, we have to do both because our unemployment insurance system is broken. Like, I talk with unemployed workers who come in my mentions on Twitter and they're like, please keep fighting for the checks. I can't get my unemployment benefits. I need money. Like, I'd rather have the unemployment benefits too, but but that's just a reality of the system. But I do talk about in the piece, there are ways to fix this. Like, we know how to fix these problems. It's just a political will.
Yeah. So I'm going to indulge myself with
Okay.
one or two more questions before I get back to the audience. So let's start talking about culture. So we've talked about the sort of racial inequality and sort of the inequality in outcome of economic policy. How does the sort of unequal input into the field of economics, who the economists are, making these issues sort of contribute to that issue?
Yeah, so I firmly believe that the issues of a lack of diversity, a lack of inclusion, that have been part of the economics profession, part of the economic policy making world for like ever, uh, cause our economic policies, what actually goes out into the world, to be not all they could be, right? And that we don't really think about how this will affect everyone, right? And there are differences. Like we have different lived experiences, we have different challenges we face on like a whole range of issues. And if you have, I mean, this is not too far of a characterization. If you have policy being made, if you have economic advice being made by a group of white men in their 60s to 70s, and all from elite institutions, and often multiple generations into elite living, I mean,
Yeah.
they could bring policies and advice. Like you don't have to be those other people to like care about them and do good policy. It is really hard, and a much more authentic way to do it is to bring some of those people to the table, like empower them to be a part of the decisions and the evaluation of what's happening in the world. And that piece, like we're at a moment in economics and in economic policy where it's like diversity is important. We need to bring in people from different backgrounds and different, okay, this is good, this is a first step. And yet I talk about in my disgrace piece, there's a line in there that I think is really, really important. I say diversity without inclusion is cruel. So if you bring people in, and they often don't get brought to the table, they get brought to like the row of chairs outside the big table. But if you bring them into the room because you say, oh, we want diverse voices, oh, we want to hear what you say. And if every time you try and say something, they cut you off, they explain it away, or they don't even let you talk, and you feel like if you say, hey, excuse me, that policy you want to pass, that's racist. If you are afraid that they're going to turn around and be like, who are you to judge us, right? And this, it's hard to have someone tell you what you're doing you may be well intended, and they're like, but it's not good and it's going to hurt people, right? So like without inclusion, you don't get the benefits of the diverse perspectives, improve policy, and you have the potential to hurt the very people that you are trying to bring in. Now, I think the conversation and like people understand these two things. It's actually a lot easier to hire people of all different shapes and sizes. It's a lot more work to bring them into a conversation from which they have not been a part of. So, but it can be done, but it's a real challenge. And I was talking with a reporter this morning about these issues of diversity and inclusion in the Biden administration. And one of the things I said is it's impressive. I truly believe that President Biden has a priority on this. I think he understands fundamentally it's about better policy, serving the American people better. But you can't just have aspirations. You have to have a system, you have to set up institutional practices that force you to do it and force you to hold yourself accountable. And that's really hard in an administration that's like running 60 miles an hour in like 10 directions, right? So I think that's the piece where I'm less convinced that they really got that figured out. But but
Okay.
they care, so we'll see. I
See,
mean,
yeah.
most departments don't care. And I've talked with a lot of institutions, and I talk about a lot of departments in that piece that frankly are just like they're just hurting people,
Yeah.
like a lot of people.
I'd actually really love to continue this discussion, but I am
Yeah.
aware that the audience has
Oh
questions, and
yes, we
I
got
think it's
lots of.
important that they get answered, otherwise there will be a mutiny. So we'll start with this one from Andrea. What do you think are the downsides of aiming for full employment as a macro target, as opposed to things like raising productivity and improving long-term economic welfare?
Yeah, so this is really important because I don't know what full employment is. right? Like I don't,
Mm.
and economists haven't, like I think to hold ourselves accountable, we have to have a number, we have to have a metric, we got to have something we look at. But this is an open, like we should have you help on this, right? Like this is a very open question about what does it mean for full employment? What does it mean for the people who want to work to have the opportunities? Like just getting it, like right now, someone who doesn't have a job, getting a job at McDonald's, that's better probably than nothing, but like that's probably not where they want to stop their career. So are there opportunities, job ladders that get them into a better paid, more stable job? But like, do we measure that? Are people being able to send their kids to college and taking jobs where we get better and better at doing things and do more and more, which is what productivity is, right? And people tend to, people who are viewed as more productive, such as it is, are often paid more, right? So like this is, so what do we mean? Like what is the goal is a really important conversation, and I think it was one that was begun decades and decades ago, and it kind of flagged a little bit. So I don't pretend that I know the answer, but I feel very convicted that the answer to that question should be, we need to answer that question, and whatever that answer is needs to be held front and center in like where we're trying to, and it's not the only goal. I mean, like we don't want to destroy the planet either, like climate change. I mean, there's just a lot of, depending on your views on different things, like there's a lot of things that we should be aiming at to improve as a society. But in this space of like the economy and the labor market, I think it's very much an open question.
Mm. So, continuing a bit on the theme of full employment, and I think you'll be relieved that this is sort of the opposite question to the one you've been having over the past few weeks. Why
Okay.
stop at $2,000 stimulus? If this is the optimal size, to create full employment, would it be better to just raise the stimulus to 2,500?
Yeah, so this is where fiscal policy, it is true of monetary policy too. There's an art to it, there's a science, and then there's politics. Oh, and then there's reality too. I mean, like there's a lot of different pieces. My role as an economist is to give the best economic advice I can. And that falls into a lot of these technical, and so I get asked about this. How big should the check be? And I like, my answer is big. So, and like, but honestly, like that the CARES Act, that they decided they had enough space and decided it was appropriate to do $1,200. That was twice what the 2008 payments were. And 2008 was twice of what 2001 was. So I was like, wow, $1,200, that's really good. $600 or $500 a kid, that's really good. I mean, I was furious when President Trump didn't just sign the $600 relief package because it delayed some unemployment benefits. But when he came, I was like, $2,000 for everybody? I'm like, wow. Like for in US families, there are many where that is real money. Like it just, so to me that was like that came out of nowhere. Like I was just like, oh wow. And then people grabbed onto it. And of course, like that, the $2,000, which of course now has become $1,400, and there's lots of tweets about 600 plus 1,400 and two. Anyway, like that was just. I wish we were back in that Twitter debate because the last few weeks have been so much worse. But like that, not surprisingly, is the most popular economic policy that is being considered right now in this relief package. 8 out of 10 Americans support those checks. Only like 7 out of 10 Americans support the relief package, right? Like these are incredibly popular, but the CARES Act ones were popular too, right? So there's no, partly because we don't know the goal, what's mission accomplished, and partly like a $20 trillion economy, there's a lot of moving pieces, right? So I don't know the amount. I do think it's very good that it's large. It's meaningful. This is real money for a lot of families. It's the same dollar amount for everybody. Like which there's just a lot of good economic reasons. And because it's so popular, I truly believe that it gives cover. And this is me putting on my little policy hat. Because it's so popular, it allows that relief package to have other benefits that are less popular. In the United States, benefits for the unemployed, especially better benefits, are not universally popular. There is a very sad but pervasive discourse that the unemployed are lazy and we shouldn't pay them to sit on their couch. And the thing is, if you get a check, $2,000, and you won't feel so upset about the neighbor down the street, oh, he gets 2,000 and then he gets an extra 300 a week, right? Like, because you got something, he got something, yeah, he's out of work. But if you don't have something you get, and we spend $1 trillion, and like so and so down the street, like that creates tension. And there's a reason why the universally popular parts of relief, money to families, money to small businesses, they show up in every package because they're kind of like the glue. And then really the arguments between the Democrats and the Republicans, they're about the other packages. And of course there's arguments about how big it should be, like the checks. But really, like, for all the arguments about targeting the checks and bringing it from 75, like that whole discussion, I mean, it was going to drop 40 million people off of topping up to 2,000. So that's a lot of people with broken promises. But it's only going to be $35 billion out of a $1.9 trillion package. Like, this was nothing in terms of the total cost. So like, but they weren't going to cut it all together. They were just like trying to like tweak the talking points. So I think it's good policy. I think it's good for families. And I show that in the relief, and that's a lot of what the Substack piece is. I think we have very good evidence that people spend like a half to 2/3 of those stimulus checks get spent. This time they might get spent a little bit more slowly. The American people, if nothing else, like to buy stuff. Like, consumer spending is 70% of GDP. They will spend it.
On that point, sorry
No,
to
no, no,
interrupt
go.
you.
No,
So
go.
we have another question, and we've just got to that. Do you think that a lot of this isn't again, Katie? Do you think that a lot of the stimulus was unable to materialise because it had gone straight to savings?
No, I don't. But this was a really important question to ask. Like, I do research on what do households do with their fiscal stimulus. We have a survey. We've run this. We've used the same type of method. I and Matthew Shapiro and Joel Slemrod at the University of Michigan. Like, I studied 2008. We did all these different, like, there were tax credits and payroll tax that we used all of that through the 2008. Matthew and Joel had studied 2001. We have this very like set way we do our survey. Then we came to 2020 and we're like, we got some money. We're going to write, do this question, the survey. And Matthew and I were both macroeconomists. Joel does public finance. We were having a friendly discussion, maybe a little argument sometimes, about what the results would say, because Matthew was of this view that the economy shut down. We're going to give people money. They won't be able to spend the money. So it's just going to be saved and blah, blah, blah. And I said, no. We have the mother of all demand shocks. At that point, we had, not 10 million jobs lost. We had like 20 million jobs lost. So I'm like, they've got things they got to spend it on. And in fact, I was right. People did spend, on total, they spent about a half by our method. Some people show a little bit higher, some people show a little bit lower, but when that was about exactly what we'd seen in 2008. So it's like, oh, they spent it. Now, if you looked under the hood at what did you spend it on, not surprisingly, far fewer were going on vacations and a lot more were buying groceries, right? Like, so there was this shift in the composition, but people spent it and they spent it quickly, right? Like, this is part of, so it pushes this money out. But there's a couple things here, and it, like, you need it spent so that like you get stimulus and you get the economy going. Like, that's kind of the conventional wisdom. But I like the payments because you give money to people and you tell them, do what is best for you and your family. Like, we also saw and have in the past seen people use it to pay off debt. We had people in their survey reporting they used it to pay off payday loans, car title loans. I mean, these have enormous interest rates on them. If we give you money and that's what you do with it, thumbs up. If sorry, and this time we did actually see more people shifting from debt to savings, because I mean, it was really scary this spring.
Yeah.
Right? And so if you could set aside, and most Americans do not have a nest egg, like nothing set aside, and that actually goes way up into the upper middle class. Like, some people just, you can be house rich, money poor. like I am right now. We just bought a house last summer, my goodness. But like, so you don't have a lot of savings, and if the world is on fire, you're like, I'm just going to take this and set it aside. And so, but they will eventually spend that. And I do think as the economy reopens, I'm not sure we'll see more spending, because a lot of that savings is with very rich people who didn't get a check, but we will see the composition change. We're going to see service spending, come back.
Yeah. So on the subject of the
we're
economy reopening, I know we're sort of slightly overrunning, but
Yeah.
Hugo, I'm going to ask your question. Sorry,
Yeah.
and I have so many more questions for you, but
Well,
I don't want to
we'll
keep
be-
you too long.
Yep.
So Hugo asked, since many jobs have gone online and may stay this way, will this sort of permanently reshape the labour market and actually kind of present a challenge to the economy, or do you think the impact in the long run is going to be fairly minimal?
So this has been such a disruptive event, such a historical event. There will be change. Like the world will be different in 5 years than we would have expected at the start of 2020. Like there's just no way that isn't going to be the case. And yet I'm very okay. I was a forecaster for 10 years at the board. I mean, like, we got to do it, but we always said after a year even or two, it's basically we're as good as monkeys throwing darts. Right. So I feel like a lot of the discussion about the world is going to change. I think we should think about the different implications, but we shouldn't get too like fired up, because probably the most profound thing that'll change, we haven't really been talking about. I don't know what that is, but I do think one, you can have very small changes that can have very big ripple effects. So one thing I was talking with someone about today was, okay, there's a bunch of people like me that can work from home, right? And so when it becomes safer to be downtown DC, I mean, a lot of people miss being around other people and getting away from their home and their children for a break during the day. So like, which is work is a break sometimes. So like, eventually we'll feel like, oh, we can be in DC. And employers like the federal government, I know of no one that they've been told they're going back this summer. Like September is probably the earliest. And the fact is, like, governments function just fine with everybody off in their little, apartments and homes and stuff. So, but the problem is, as long as the federal government doesn't go back into DC, as long as those companies don't bring their workers back, there was a massive service industry to cater to every whim of the people making six-figure salaries in those buildings, the coffee shops, the dry cleaners, it's a ghost town in DC. So all of those service sector jobs, which were low paid but important to those, and there were a lot of them, they're not there. So even like, it's kind of like you could come back but if you're missing even like 20%, like if they just say, well, stay remote, or workers who ask for, I want to stay remote because of family reasons, like that affects not just those 20%, but then it starts to affect other workers whose lives were but of course over time they'll readjust and they'll just move out to whatever suburb and like put food and things outside, and then we'll go by that. So there's an adjustment period. We won't, like, until the vaccines are out and people are safe, like COVID is driving this whole thing.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So on that note, I guess.
A happy note. So
yep. I guess I'm sorry, I think we really will have to end here.
Yeah.
Which is a shame. I really enjoyed talking to you, but so I'm going to release the audience now. I hope you enjoyed our talk. Please come back. Oh,
yes.
sorry.
Yeah, I did. One quick thing. So I appreciate being here. For all of you students, I know we only got to go through certain questions. One of my absolute passions is talking to and advising students. If there's anything that you want to reach out about at any point, like, let me know, because you all are the future, and this is like, I'm here to help cheer you on, because you're going to get us across the finish line. So yay, you all. Thank you for having me, and stay safe, everybody.
Thank you. That's a really nice thing to say.